we're going to consider the public excluded items, and the public excluded items, then we'll go and head for the back to open session at 1 p.m. So with that, we have Councillor Burko and Councillor Hodge. Second, all those in favour. Oh, first of all, we'll read the reasons why we're going to public exclude. Short, briefly. The reason why.
Short and briefly.
Yes.
We're entering public excluded for the purpose of confirming and or receiving minutes. The reasons for these minutes being in public excluded are specified in the open reports in the agenda for those who would like to check. Otherwise, they're currently on screen.
Put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, carried. We're now in public excluded, but we we're doing it in 10 minutes. So we need to pause to put the steam engine in reverse. That's true. True. Do you want a better understanding? I realise that, yes. So I'll just get advice that we're back into this meeting. We're back. So we're now in open session, but we are ahead of time. I take your advice, Democracy Services, whether we can commence. We can commence? Yes. Right, we are commencing with the next item, which is the Urban Development and Future Proof Update, page 83. Let me get my steam engine.
It's the regional policy statement.
Yes. 83.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just...
Yes, we'll have the CEO introduce the item.
Just for Miffy's sake, he's just walked in the room, probably so she can catch her breath. So we're going to start discussion, but I think if I'm correct, no decisions can be made till after 1 o'clock. Is that right, Dave? Oh, we can make... Okay, the live streaming. Sorry.
Right. So I'll ask Miffy and Director May to present the report on page 83.
Okay, kia ora tātou. I hope you had a very nice lunch.
Yes.
As you may recall from my regular reports to the Strategy and Policy Committee, we have been preparing a change to the regional policy statement to incorporate the requirements of the National Policy Statement on Urban Development. It also is to include, to update the future-proof components that are contained within the RPS to reflect that the strategy has just been updated. And you will note that the next item on the agenda is to adopt that future-proof strategy. So we have been working on this RPS change for some time, and have been working with our Tier 1 and Tier 3 territorial authorities and JMA partners throughout the process to prepare the draft provisions. The draft provisions have also been through an independent planning peer review process and a legal review. So we're asking you now to endorse this consultative draft, which is on pages 87 to 162 of the agenda, and is also supported by a draft Section 32 report, which provides a bit more context. So if you are happy to endorse it, this will allow us to send it out to iwi authorities for pre-notification feedback, which is a requirement under the Resource Management Act. We're also planning to send it to our territorial authorities and to the Minister for the Environment as well. We are intending to incorporate any feedback from that process into the draft and then report it back to you in September to get the plan notified.
Right.
And happy to receive comments or questions.
As I understand it, the future proof is actually a collaboration of 7 agencies, correct?
Yes.
So therefore it is not in council's area to either accept or reject it outright, can comment and can put forward views, but it's actually as a collective. Is that correct, that we are operating in?
So the Future Proof Implementation Committee is a joint committee of the councils.
That's right.
So they have endorsed the strategy and they have recommended it for the partner councils to adopt. So that's...
And can you report on whether councils have already adopted any of it, this consultation approach? Where are we at in terms of other parties?
Okay, so this item relates to the Regional Policy Statement consultative draft. So this is our document that
our one, yes?
Yes, so
Not
the next item is the
gotcha.
Future Proof Strategy.
Okay, so I was looking at both together.
Yes, so the other TAs do also have to do plan changes to implement the MPSUD, and they are in the process of getting those ready for notification.
Through you, Mr. Chair, if I can just add, so as Miffy said, this is our regional policy statement.
Right.
It is our responsibility to change our regional policy statement. As a consequence to that, it provides the overarching framework for those other future-proof partner councils, because the regional policy statement sets the overarching framework. What has been important, and hats off to Miffy and Councillor Strange and all of those who have been through the process, is that we have used the future-proof partnership to effectively do a lot of the work to inform this RPS plan change.
That's great to have that clarity. Thank you. I think it's very informative. Carry on. Any other questions or comments? I have one, but Councillor White.
Yes, so my question is probably applicable for this and also for the future proof bit next. But so just looking at it, so you're going out with consultation, but have the councillors in each territorial authority had any kind of presentation of this or the future-proof stuff, or is it just staff so far who've looked at things? And I saw somewhere in here that staff are actually going to be the ones who are consulted, is that right? But not governance of
We have
territorial
provided
authorities?
it to the, so we have our Tier 1 and Tier 3 councils under the MPSUD, and we have worked with the staff. We did provide them with a copy of the draft for them to take to their councillors if they chose to. They have all decided to wait until it actually goes out for notification.
Right, but then they will actually talk to the governance wing? They will automatically, okay, so that's good. That's probably the most important thing I wanted to ask. Thank you.
Great. I've got a question. Most people don't look at the glossary of terms that I have. And I've got a question around that, particularly since I've taken an interest in this council over 2 terms about air quality and particulate matter. And it's referred to in the glossary of terms as being PM10, but I understand that we are moving towards 2.5. Why are we talking about PM10 when 2.5 seems to be order of the day for the future? Thank you.
Okay, so this plan change is the scope of it, are the changes that are required under the MPSUD. So all the text that is in black is the existing regional policy statement. So we have just focused on the changes that are required at this point in time. I understand that that change hasn't yet been made around the air quality standard, but it is coming at some stage. So once that does happen, we'll have that, the scope to then make that change to the...
Wouldn't it be appropriate then, if you were a member of the public or any other party, to signify or signal that? Because if we're setting down a policy which is looking into the future, and there's definitely a move towards already recording PM 2.5, shouldn't we disclose that that is something that's currently in the mix in some way, refer to that?
If I can respond to this, Mr. Chair. So as Miffy said, this is the scope for this plan change is very specific to respond to the National Policy Statement for Urban Development. So we are limited to what we can do.
Right.
While there are matters such as you've identified, elsewhere in the RPS, we have been very specific with the scope. If we were to start looking at other matters of the RPS, then that would require Section 32 analysis and a lot more information, a lot more budget and resourcing than what we've had available. Also, we have been reticent to change the RPS, knowing full well that we've got a change to national legislation that's going to require some changes. We have on our books a task to scope up what a change to the RPS could look like from a natural hazards management perspective. Councillor Tegg has asked us, what potentially that could look like. So we've been very purposeful in limiting the scope of this change. What we can do, though, I think is in the narrative and the supporting narrative for notification is just make that very clear. This is singularly purposed. While there may be other things, they will be picked up at subsequent processes.
Yeah, and I think that's very appropriate, given that environment and all aspects of environment is very much topical these days. Councillor Tegg.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I want to understand better the scope of this change. I'm looking at paragraph 11 on page 84, where Tier 1 and Tier 3 authorities are defined. But what if you're a council that doesn't fall within those definitions at the moment? Do these changes, for example, there's reference on page 124 to Tier 3 outside future-proofing, a whole bunch of criteria. Do those criteria apply to non-Tier 1 or Tier 3 councils, or are they excluded at the moment?
Through the Chair, the MPSUD is quite specific to where it does apply. It has a definition of urban environment, which is a population of 10,000 or a labour market of 10,000 or an intention to be of that size. So we have tried to interpret that through future-proof in this plan change to make it clear when a council falls into this that definition, and then these requirements apply. So the way that we've written it, we have a number of councils that are definitely Tier 3, and we've got some that are on the cusp, and it depends on what they decide in terms of their growth aspirations as to whether they will then become Tier 3. So we've tried to write it in a way that is flexible so that it's clear when they will and won't be a Tier 3, and then these provisions apply. We do have existing provisions in the regional policy statement that apply to all growth across the region, regardless of whether you're Tier 1 or Tier 3. So they will continue to apply outside of those areas.
Right. So I'm just thinking of a scenario in Thames Coromandel where there's a proposed structure plan for housing on the more elevated land between Thames and Pyral, and that could be quite a major development. And so, you know, there's some really good provisions here. For example, one's around, you know, the role of public transport. So if you're, you know, away from a main centre, what provision are you making for, you know, lowering emissions and having a public connection transport facility? So I suppose you know, I'd like to see those provisions apply to this new proposed development, but at the moment you're telling me they won't, which, you know, is a bit of a concern.
So we have the development principles that do apply everywhere. So I would have to have a quick look to see what page that they are actually on, and they do talk about accessibility and public transport. They're maybe not quite as directive as the ones that have come from the NQUD.
Yeah, certainly not. No.
Yes, but in terms of Thames Coromandel District Council, we have had discussions with them about whether they might qualify in the future, and it really does hinge on the outcome of their growth strategy as to what level of growth they propose, as to whether it tips them over into these into having to comply with these provisions for Tier 3.
It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation as to what comes first. Right?
So, just observing, so if we get another Hiniwai situation or new development, we go for a zone change, does the appropriate conditions looking to mirror the sort of things that we're talking about here going to impact on those zone changed areas? They might be quite considerable when you've got this big push for more housing.
So the NPS UD does require the RPS to contain criteria for what is called out of sequence and unanticipated development. So there is quite a list of things that need to be satisfied for that development to proceed under, as unanticipated. So.
Okay, thank you.
Just one other brief point, and it's probably to the chair's point, it may be out of scope for this, but something to flag. I'm just noting there's on the effects of climate change, issue 1.2 on page 87, there's this rather strange statement that New Zealand's response in terms of actions to reduce climate change is primarily a central government one rather than a local government one. I think I'm not sure that's appropriate any longer.
So
that'll be something I'd flag to see removed.
So through you, Mr. Chair, that speaks to the comments earlier about the currency of the RPS. It was notified in 2016, was current at the time. That opportunity cost of reviewing something that we know is going to look perhaps a little bit different in a couple of years, but that's in fact, in respect to that, we have Blair Dickey about to start a piece of work that's going to go through not only from a climate responsiveness perspective, but freshwater and biodiversity to really have a look at a potential freshen up. I guess we were loath to put anything in this change. You know, it's that tension between efficiency, but trying to keep it very focused on what is essentially a very directive national policy statement on urban development.
Right.
Definitely time for a tidy up.
So it's directive, but it might be viewed as a concern if we were going out with that line in the document.
It's, through you, Mr. Chair, we just need to be very careful.
That's what I want to understand.
Making any changes
Yep.
outside it, but we do need to recognise that the currency of the RPS
Could
is
that,
dated.
could that be in the preamble, the narrative leading in, just erasing that? I understand where you're coming from, so I'm not
Yeah, it's
choose to
acknowledging the age of the planning instrument.
Yes, I understand. Totally. Councillor Teague, you're right. Councillor Nicol?
Thank you. It'll be such an improvement already on what we've got currently. More than happy to support it, of course. And all my other questions have been answered, including that last one. So I made a bunch of notes which might be helpful to someone like Ledicki or Miffy to have, just since I took the time last night, right? But for a future review, it could be cool to just mature that climate terminology. But yeah, thanks so much. Thank you.
Can you just repeat that again a bit closer, because it wasn't picked up
sorry.
down here at all? So.
Happy to support the piece of work going through. It'll be a great improvement on what we've got currently. And I made some notes last night on how to mature the climate terminology. Sometimes we're still a bit, what's the word? Like the risks are still understated. The benefits of some of the changes don't sometimes list all of the benefits, which I think would be helpful to then flow through at some stage. And I'm aware also that, you know, there are parts that have come straight from the MPS urban development, which are a bit vague actually, because when it says, you know, reduce emissions, does that mean during construction or for the people that are going to live in that community? That thing. But I'll catch up with staff to do that. Thank you.
Right. Any other comments? Yes?
I think it's a bit further to that, and it's just about
Take
what...
your speaker a bit closer. That'd be
Sorry.
I mean your microphone.
It's further to Dennis and Jennifer's comment on page 87. You know, under the explanation, the insert there, what does that mean, Miffy, in practice? What actually could that look like? See where I'm talking about? And within New Zealand's urban environments, that urban form supports reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and resilience to the current and future effects of climate change. Big sentence. What does it look like in practice?
So in terms of the reduction of the greenhouse gases, a lot of the focus, particularly through the Metro Spatial Plan transport business case, is about providing those transport options and intensifying in locations where people have access to services or access to public transport to reduce the private vehicle usage. And in terms of resilience, a lot of that is about not building in the wrong place, so keeping people away from natural hazards, including those that are going to increase over time. So they're sort of the key things that I can think of in our practice. There'll be other things as well.
And forgive me because I don't come from a planning background, but is business land a defined term? And does that business land give effect or recognise that we live in a gig economy? So I would have said the demarcation between business land that's not capitalised and not defined versus the reality of the situation of a gig economy. Does that not invite considerable debate?
Generally, it's understood as land that is zoned for a commercial purpose, so under a district plan.
Yeah.
So, councillors, if I can just assist, this is a regional policy statement, so it is the high-level statement that connects our regional plan and coastal plan and district plans to overarching what we're looking to achieve for the region from a land use, environment and transportation connectivity perspective. So the kind of conversation you're looking for, Councillor McPherson, would probably be in one of those lower level planning documents. the definition of business land, as Miffy said, commonly we would say it's land that's identified for industrial and business purposes. The curse of the RMA is each of the TAs probably have a different definition for it, which is why we're going to see the reform we're about to get.
Thank you. And I didn't understand the term reverse sensitivity. What does that mean?
So that is quite a well understood planning concept, and there's a lot of case law around it. So it's basically where you have an existing use that maybe has effects outside of its own site, and then you have someone come and build next door and then start complaining about that existing site. So for an example, Fonterra suffer from that a lot with their existing plants like Tarapa. They were there first, they've been there for a long time, they built away from people. The town is now grown out around them, and they get a lot of complaints about odour and noise and light, and they're having to deal with it on an ongoing basis, and it makes their business more complicated and less viable in that location.
It is a very well-travelled piece of, court background in that area. A lot of cases in reverse sensitivity.
I didn't understand in the Section 32 report the commentary around the deletion of Coromandel Peninsula Blueprint, Taupua District 2050 and Franklin District Growth Strategy. What's like if I look at the Coromandel one, we're deleting it from this document, and the way I read it is it's because the Coromandel one is well out of date, so therefore it's not relevant to be included in here. Is that what's going on? Or?
It's more about when you put them in the RPS as a specific document, you're capturing it in a moment in time, and so you give it more weight through it being in the statutory document, but then you sort of freeze it. And as you can see with even with the RPS, and it was completed and commenced in 2016. 6 years later, there's all these things that we're finding that are already out of date. So what we're trying to do is take a more flexible approach and talk about growth strategies that are approved by council, so that they can change and update them over time, and the RPS then not being out of date. And so a bit more flexibility while still retaining a bit of certainty about the level of weight that they carry.
Thank you.
Councillor Verco.
Tracy, remember back in history, back in history, I led 5 territorial authorities who engaged a Queen's Councillor and a senior planner and challenged this regional council on its proposed regional policy statement. We challenged them on over 100 points that we, the 5 councils, said were unacceptable to us, and we won the vast majority. Those we gave away on, we didn't really care. So therefore we have learnt from our history, and this is merely reflecting a national policy statement whose rules that we salute and obey, as opposed to going out, as Councillor Tegg would like us to do, on a tangent in other areas that may cause those 5 councils to re-establish.
The comment I would make to that is, yes, yes, we did have some challenge when we first developed the regional policy statement, but as I said previously, we have developed this change in consultation with those councils who will be affected by the NPS urban development. We've also talked to those other councils who might not be as front and centre, so that they are aware of what's in here, and as Miffy said, provided the flexibility should they start bumping up against those thresholds that are stated in the NPS.
Attitude at this time is to applaud.
Thank you. Councillor Mahuta.
There we go. Just a couple of questions, if anything, because we did make the same comments about Tarapa and the inevitable flow-through effect. So where does this help us with that ribbon development conversation that has already occurred in Pokemon to Kaupata and Miki? Is there improvement now that the future-proof considerations are all in? and the status of treaty settlement lands, because a lot of it is river adjacent or urban adjacent. So, thank you.
Through the chair, so the future-proof strategy already had a focus on providing for compact settlements and trying to focus most development within urban areas. And with the NPSUD, there is a focus on that as well, sort of a concentrated and compact city. So that is, and also using robust evidence to support your ability to provide for population within your existing urban areas. So we had a housing and business capacity assessment carried out, and that has given us the confidence through the process to say that the land we had in the future-proof strategy is sufficient without having to add a whole lot more. Through the future-proof strategy consultation process, we did get a large number of submissions for additional urban land, over 4,000 hectares. I believe that out of those, we only accepted one of them, and that was for a relatively discrete area of industrial land in an area where there was an identified shortage. So we have tried to rein that in and make sure that we are staying very focused and trying to support our public transport as well through being compact and putting the population in an area they can be serviced. In terms of the treaty land, yeah, sure.
Can you press your button there?
LIVESTREAM?
And then press it again.
And we wouldn't want, so taken by Public Works for energy, then promised back in treaty settlement, but in the interim, while it's still a power site, it's an industrial site. Now, it's got 5 maraes around it, but hypothetically it could, energy to waste, waste to energy plants, all of those are popping up all over the place. So I guess what assurance that it will be still at least the same aligned purpose, that it will still be a power site if it's anything, and that no one else can build around it because it's provided for in this plan.
I would say the response is this plan, this policy statement does not override zoning or rules that exist in a district plan at the moment. The security you have is any change to any land use zone and any district plan has to go through a public process. So this again is just rising up, providing the overarching framework. The difference I see is between pages 135 and pages 136 of the agenda when we went through the regional policy statement, and it was a hell of a challenge and many hours of hearings with all the future-proof partners to get agreement to a high-level map such as on page 135. We've matured a lot. The future-proof partnership has matured a lot, and we now know a lot more about our land use and transport and how to create better communities. And I think that for me is one of the benefits of this plan change to the RPS. But it does not automatically mean any changes to district plans. They need to progress through the process. Thank you.
Councillor Husband. Just wait from.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry, I've been just offline for a minute. For another section, or are we in the everybody part of this section?
Can you repeat that? We got about half that question.
Sorry, are we still in public excluded, or are we in the open section?
We're in the open section. Yeah, public exclude's gone through.
Okay, just a couple of. Okay, cool. Just a couple of questions. When will a section 32 and some costs to ratepayers be put around this aspirational stuff on future-proof?
So, we're on the. This is appropriate on this question?
So the Section 32 report does relate to the RPS change. It doesn't necessarily have the costs for future-proof implementation. So there is an implementation plan as part of future-proof, and each of the partners have allocated responsibilities, but the next stage of the process will be to put costs around it. So that that work hasn't been done yet.
So it's coming up.
Okay, and if page 147 is on this, could you please tell me what you mean by a water body?
So, Councillor Husband, you may have missed
Hello?
the previous conversation, but water bodies.
Okay, forget it. Yep, thank you. All good.
Do you want to just briefly cover that? So,
Councillors, anywhere in black we are not changing. It is outside the scope of this proposal. It's only the words in red that we're able to change as a result of the scope of the NPS urban development.
So it's basically giving effect to the national policy statement within our current, which we're obliged to do.
Correct.
Okay, no, that's fine. If that's what you mean, that's fine. Thank you.
That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor White.
Yeah, I just had a quick follow-on question from something Councillor McPherson raised with you, and that was around
Bring it a bit closer.
the bits that are crossed out, which are to do with things like Taupo District 2050 and the Coromandel Peninsula Blueprint, etc. And you said that you wanted more flexibility rather than referring to specific growth strategies. So the only thing is in here it says growth strategies approved by council. So what does it mean by approved by council? Does that mean by our council or approved by each individual territorial authority? Just wanted to clarify that because normally each of those growth strategies are done by the territorial authority, aren't they?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so it's basically the territorial authority put it through a special consultative process under the Local Government Act and then adopt the outcome.
Okay,
So
when
just
it
to make
says
it
council, it is
yes,
specifically the territorial authority. Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you. That's it. So that's it. Who would like to move what's up on the screen there? Yes, Councillor Nebo and Councillor Nicol. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, carry. Thank you for that, councillors. We now move on to 8.3, page 248, which is the adoption of the future-proof strategy. And we have with us our staff again to take us through this one.
Okay, so the first future-proof strategy was completed in 2007, and this really came about to provide certainty for the Waikato Expressway, which we have just seen completed. So since then, there has been one minor update to the strategy, but this has been the first real review of that document. So as well as the outcomes of the Hamilton to Auckland Corridor Plan and the Hamilton Waikato Metro Spatial Plan and the resulting transport program business case, it also looked at how to more fully incorporate Te Ture Whaimana to put the river at the heart of the strategy. It brought in the concept of the blue-green network and updated the settlement pattern. It also has reflected those national policy statement on urban development requirements, such as setting direction for intensification and setting criteria for the out-of-sequence and unanticipated development. The strategy has been through a special consultative process under the Local Government Act with a public engagement period, hearings and deliberations. So Councillor Strange was on the hearings panel for that as the WRC rep. So the Future-Proof Implementation Committee endorsed the strategy last month and has recommended to the partners for each of them to adopt it. They've also made some recommendations and set the scope for the future development strategy. So that is a requirement under the National Policy Statement for Urban Development, and the future-proof strategy goes most of the way to satisfy that, but needs a bit more around the implementation and infrastructure and the costing. So that we are about to, well, we already started work on that process, and that is to be completed to inform the long-term plan in 2024.
So this is where I jumped the gun earlier, that essentially we're part of that group of 7. So it's a matter of collective approval, basically, and that's what we're looking for here. Any comment, Councillor Strange?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yeah, I had the privilege of sitting on this through the process, and a big thanks to Miffy for all your help with that. But yeah, I think Future Proof is it's a very unique committee with having 3 government ministers sitting on it as well. Minister of Housing, Minister of Local Government and Minister of Transport. So tying in with central government policies and hopefully funding, it's set us up to be in a really good place. And the collaboration through the hearings and the everyone being on the same page was really apparent through the hearings process. And I believe that we've come to a really good place in accepting the strategy. So we're happy to
We'll move that.
please.
Right. Second by Katarina Hodge, and comment, Katarina.
So, I need to, I guess, thank Angela. She took a space where myself and Russ were members on, but I've been with Future Proof almost from day dot, not for the council, of course. And the strategy we worked on for a little while.
Yep.
And so I'm happy in the space it is too. So yeah, thanks for all that work with her, and especially for Angela, because she went on the hearing panel where me and Russ decided not to go.
Very good.
So I'll second
Yep.
the motion that we move.
Okay. No other comment, Councillor Kneebone? Have you got your light on? Who's got it? Right.
Not a biggie, but I just noticed in terms of reducing climate impacts, it says here, it talks in the beginning of another 60 to 70,000 dwellings coming on stream over the next period, and then it talks later on, this decision, i.e. adopting this document, is likely to result in a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by increasing housing intensity. It seems to me that would be on a per capita basis rather than incomplete, wouldn't it? Because I'm struggling to understand how another 60 to 70,000 houses worth of people and all their impacts is going to result in a reduction of GHG, but it seems logical that on a per capita basis it will. I mean, I realise it's a bit late to change it, but I just thought it should be, it's a little bit, it seems misleading, I don't know, but yeah.
Yeah, I guess part of the strategy is also intensifying in locations like the CBD and other places close to public transport, so you do potentially get existing residents moving into those areas and not using their cars, but whether it will ultimately be a reduction overall, I can see your point.
Otherwise, yeah, it's cool.
So, Councillor Nicol?
Yeah, just really like what's in there. Same comments as with the previous piece, though, that the climate conversation can be matured further in the document in future. So just wanted to flag it. Thought it was interesting that the National Emission Reduction Plan and Adaptation Plan weren't even mentioned in the central government response section, for example, or the RMA amendment stuff coming in. And I thought it was weird that the trends that they've listed on page 271 on our agenda, but talked about demographics, but neglected to mention the Māori rangatahi wave that's coming that we just talked about recently. That was all. And so around the maturing of it, I thought it was interesting that we hardly ever we often mention the transport and urban design piece, but we hardly ever mention the energy piece, which is so, it's our third biggest emissions piece and a really big opportunity and also a big piece for our economy as well. And very last comment is, I really like the name change, going more from a growth strategy to a development strategy. Those two words are very different, and in my thinking of development is definitely one that I prefer rather than predicating everything on growth is amazing. But yeah, it's actually really awesome having seen it over the time to come to what it is, and yeah, good on the hearing panel and submitters and everyone for getting it to that point.
Thanks, Councillor. Very good. Councillor Mahuta.
No, just really heartened that you said the start of the last plan and its end, there's MVP, a viable product that people can see, and so that's a product of future proof. So if we were to roll this one forward, what is it that we'll see? Because a lot of the criticism from partners in the past was, depending on the levels of energy of partners to buy into the plan and its long legs, was its successful deployment. So I'm really, don't get me wrong, I think the work is great and partnered up is great, but what are we all committing to? Because I know when I joined this council with Future Proof, there was very low level of commitment, and it's had peaks and surges And really the only thing that came out was this transport network, which was highly partnered with NZTA. So again, I want to commit to it, but what in your mind, what will we see in the cycle of this development plan?
Okay, through the chair, there is an implementation plan as part of it in Part D. So it does list a number of initiatives that come from the Future Proof strategy and the partners that will lead and be involved in them. And a number of them have actually been already established and are ongoing. So a lot of the water work has been done. There's program business cases that have been undertaken. So the first stage was to assess where our water systems were at in terms of their capacity and where there were issues, which it was identified there were a number. And then basically the next stage has been what are our options for fixing them? And I believe that they've now come to some, at least for the Southern business case, they've got, so we are, no, I appreciate that.
Just one further comment through you, through the chair. For me, particularly the last couple of years with Future Proof, there's been a far more joined up conversation around growth, and one of the key reasons for Future Proof getting together was we had 3 growth councils who were all leapfrogging over one another, and we didn't have that cohesive plan. This provides that cohesive plan. Not to say we aren't going to have some tough conversations, but we have that. We also have an Auckland connection that we never had previously in the last couple of years, and the government seeing how important the Waikato is to Auckland and Auckland is to the Waikato, and the fact that we have central government in this last term sitting on Future Proof and being very vocal and visible, puts us in an incredibly good space with our regional spatial strategy coming up and the joint committees and the spatial strategy commissioners that are going to sit over those when we already have those people embedded for that high growth part of our region, not the rest, but it sets a very good platform and entry into that.
That's my observation is over this triennium, I've seen the credibility being built around this piece of work. So at the beginning, it was quite a different sort of a narrative, and now it's moved to a space where it is all powerful, and it speaks to how when you get a whole lot of voices coming to the table with a common view, you can actually move the mountain. So it does speak to a way forward, and I've been very pleased to see this. So with that, I have a mover and a seconder, and there's one more speaker. You got the last say, Councillor.
There's clearly been a mountain of work gone into this document. And I'm left wondering, for the average punter, they're not going to pick this document up and read it. The average punter is not going to pick this document up and read it, and yet there's so much in here that's valuable even for the average punter to be aware of. I guess my question is, and if you cast your mind back to the start of this triennium, this council worked really hard on putting our strategy on one page. I think to improve the utility and uptake of this document, putting this document on one page, it's very doable, and it would improve its utility. It would make it worth someone pick it up on one page and say, gee, this looks really interesting, and I might go and have a look at the I might go and look at the parent document and just delve into it. But I just think it's got a lot of data in it, a lot of information, and for a strategy document, I don't feel like I pick this document up, go to a barbecue, have a beer with someone and say, here's what the Future Proof strategy is about. Whereas Barry, Russ and I tested our one-pager with Chris Luxon one night, and it was really nice having that one-pager to say to Chris Luxon, this is what we stand for, and it was the basis of a really meaningful conversation, and I think we could achieve the same with this document.
I think Councillor, there's some eloquence about what you say, and I think staff will take that on board It's probably when you're looking at, and the CEO has a comment.
Yeah, it's actually a question for Miffy and Tracy. Is that a matter that needs to go back to the Future Proof Implementation Committee to consider putting a one-page strategy together, or is it ours?
I would suggest that it's something that we can take back to Future Proof Chief Executive's Advisory Group in terms of the communication collateral that supports this. I'm thinking a map and what's on page 267 together is probably all we need to try and catch people.
Yeah, and I think you expressed that well. It's the communication strategy around this. You're not modifying what's in it. You're just picking up the key salient points out of it. So it's the communication strategy. I'd agree with that. Any further comment?
Yeah, no, I think we could do more with it, and this might be an example, Miffy, of not asking for permission, but we might ask for forgiveness rather than permission. And I would be really keen if you guys had a go at getting this onto one page. I'd love to sit alongside of it and critique it and help, because there'll be a lot of people in the Waikato that will pick that document up on a one page and say, wow, that's seriously impressive. If it goes back to another committee to get done, it'll take quite a long while, whereas I think we could, to Tracy's point, we could have a crack at it.
It is going back to, rather than committee, it's going back to the CEOs for the communication. But I think they will take your offer on on its merits, and the CEOs will obviously look at this. And you've heard our CEO here recognise that the message is loud and clear. So I think we can rest it with that. But very good points made, I think, by the councillor. With that, I'd like to conclude this session, and we have a mover and a seconder. I'd like to put the vote. All those in favour, please say aye. Those against, carried unanimously. Thank you. Thank you for all the hard work to get to this point. Ka pai. So we now move to the page 378, right at the back there. Review of conduct, code of conduct. I shouldn't say review of conduct, code of conduct. And welcome Sarah to the table, who's been working quite diligently on this matter. Sarah, would you like to present? There's some things in here which you'll hear the government has made some amendments which require the council to take them on board. And some of them are quite interesting. There's been a lot of work to try and reflect the views and the learnings from this council over the last triennium. So it's about that journey and putting that into some practical. The main use of this is, of course, for the incoming council. So that's the main use, is to inform them, not to tell them that this is what they have to have, but rather say, this is what the previous council has learnt, and also this is what legislation says, and really try to create a platform for them to consider. Sarah.
Well, Barry's right. The report really has arisen out of the experience over the triennium that you've all been over to some extent, and also the feedback that came out of the Mark Abbott workshop. And then there was an email survey sent out, set of questions sent out to members for feedback as well. So all that's been meshed together. In the meantime, there's been some significant changes in legislation. There's been additional clauses added into the Local Government Act that require much more rigorous disclosure of interests and publication of those disclosures, which publication wasn't required in the past. It was discretionary, now it's become mandatory. So this kind of puts all those bits and bobs together and puts an option for new council together in one place. So it's really on the table for your feedback at the moment, and any questions if you've got any. And I'll be taking some notes. We are expecting a new pro forma template coming through from the Local Government New Zealand any time, because they've been reviewing their template, which is optional for the sector as well. We feel that Democracy Services feel that there'll be something to be gained out of that once it lands. They've given me a copy of a rough draft of what they're up to, which has been incorporated to the extent possible, but was well off being finished when I received the rough draft. So,
right. So the summary on page 378.
378.
378, A to H really is the key elements that have been brought forward, so you can actually see in a snapshot of what the changes are. That's correct, isn't it, Sarah?
That's right.
Yeah. So any questions or comments? Councillor Kneebone.
Yeah, no, look, thanks. I really like this. Just a couple of things. First one's a bit trivial, but I'm not convinced it's right. On page 406, 6.5.
Yes, 6.5. Yes, which
members must disclose as soon as practical all compliments and complaints. I wonder whether the compliments are supposed to be there, as much as I like to crow about the compliments I get.
I mean, it's not a requirement, Steve. It's just.
So there's complaints or compliments?
Oh, it's not a requirement that you must have that as a must requirement. What I'm saying is I've put it in there, but that isn't a statutory requirement. So you could have it.
Except that, sorry, I'm assuming complaints, accidents and near misses are statutory, so it's a simple.
No, they're not.
Oh.
No.
So what we're talking about is from our learnings and from what's actually happened, there's some things which are moving us into a space where we think it's appropriate for the council going forward. We haven't just rested on the legislative and the LGNZ things. We've tried to make it more nuanced towards what suits such a council. Now, the council going forward may seek to make some modifications to it, and that's their right. But this established somewhere for them to work from. So, Stu, are you, just clarifying, are you talking about that it said compliments and it should say complaints? Or
it says compliments and complaints. I mean, my suggestion would be, given that politicians tend to have bigger egos than the average person, the CEO is going to get a report as long as he had a bloody Timbuktu on a monthly basis of all the compliments we get. I just can't see the point of the compliments one. I think the rest of it is really logical.
Right, no compliments for you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Understand that?
But the only other one was, and I sort of mentioned it to a couple of you before, there's been obviously a number of code of conduct investigations over the triennium, and acknowledging the need to respect the privacy of those involved, we often always we tend to find out through Chinese whispers what's going on, and sometimes it would be quite useful for us to know if something's happened in terms of how we conduct ourselves, etc., etc. But also the other part of it is, I think there needs to be some incentive or discipline on those in leadership roles charged with managing these and deliberating on these processes to make sure that they're held to account in terms of getting things wrapped up within an appropriate time frame as well. And I don't know, I think we should have something, whether this is the place to have it or some other part of council, I'm not sure, because there's potential for those charged with managing these to let them drift.
Yes. So the first point, I found it quite interesting that essentially when you talk about the Privacy Act, some advice to me in terms of legality is if it affects a councillor, having that communicated to another councillor is not necessarily a breach of the Privacy Act, but having it communicated to the person outside of council is. So what that's suggesting is potentially what you said around those that are charged with resolving a matter could in some way provide some degree of briefing to councillors. Obviously, it has to be carefully assessed, but that was a learning that I've only recently become aware of, because I thought, you know, you had to deal with it quite separately from everybody, but that's not from what I understand is the case. If that is that correct, Sarah? Am I correct?
Yes, that's right. And I mean, this does say that these matters could be reported on in closed session if it's justified, then certainly a legitimate privacy concern would fall into that camp. So I would imagine that reports through to council on matters involving member conduct would normally be in PEX. Some of that might get reported out at times, depending on what's going on, but initially reported through the PEX process.
I'll also get the CEO to comment.
Yeah, so from my experience, there's codes of conduct and there's codes of conduct. And we've also had other matters raised outside of code of conduct under other legislation, where it kind of gets a little bit tricky about it could have been a code of conduct. And whether privacy applies probably depends on which piece of legislation that we're working under. It's a little bit complicated, but I think the gist of what you're saying under the general, if there are ever any more codes of conduct, under the general approach, we could probably report on codes that have been in progress.
There's certainly been requests by members that they felt there wasn't enough transparency across council.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, that's just my view. Obviously, the new incoming council, we could make that a matter of, let's say, discussion by the new council as to whether they think, you know, how they'll deal with that. Would they or wouldn't they, you know, make a report under PEX? To taking on board the CEO's comment that there's different elements, different acts, and you have to be careful that you can't just throw a blanket across and say every instance. But I think the general view is if it's possible to convey something to councillors about, you know, what is happening to their colleagues, then maybe that might be able to be achieved. But that's obviously a matter for incoming council.
My mind, it has to be in a manner that's supportive, right? Because you're not
Yes.
with your burden.
Right, correct.
So, but equally, there are been situations where a number of people on either side of the spectrum could have benefited and supported
Yes.
colleagues didn't know. So that's good burden.
Yes. Fair comment. Councillor White.
Yeah, just on a slightly different topic, just the 2019 Code of Conduct did talk about it did talk about meeting attendance and what the expectations were in terms of council meetings and standing committees and annual plan and long-term plan, etc. But it doesn't really actually say anything in there about what should happen if people aren't attending. I guess from my perspective, you know, I mean, each councillor, when they stand for council, like it talks about accountability to the people who elect them. But I guess, you know, there is an expectation that we will actually turn up to meetings and we will be there to participate, etc. And if something happens throughout the term and suddenly we're not able to do that, you know, it might only be temporary, and that's obviously, you know, if it's something to do with sickness or whatever, I think that's, you know, something that needs to be borne in mind. But I think if somebody does take on a different role in council and it's not in council, somewhere else, and it prevents them from turning up to council, what I would like to know is what the expectations are around that, because I think we all declare an oath around being here and what we intend to do. So I guess my difficulty is it says that we're expected to do things, that we don't actually have any there don't appear to be any consequences there if we don't abide by those. So can someone explain that to me?
There are provisions in the Local Government Act around consequences of repeated failure to attend, and they could be made more express in a code.
But it does say in there that if you give an apology,
yes,
that it's
yes.
okay. I guess from my perspective, it is if you can't ever turn up or you very rarely can turn up, is that okay?
Well, apologies don't have to be accepted, of course. So that is up to council to decide whether it will accept apologies. Marley might want to make a comment about that particular point, actually. It may have come up in the past. You got about consequences of repeated non-attendance, other than council deciding not to accept apologies in those circumstances, and then the consequences that fall out of that under the Act, which there are, of course, council right.
Right. So just going off that point about what happens when the council doesn't accept an apology, under the rules, as I understand it, if council refused to accept the apology on three occasions, then there is definitely a consequence. So, and that's happened in other councils. So it all rests with the council, basically, as to whether it accepts or not an apology.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well. So,
Marley, do you want to make a comment?
Whether it's come up historically?
I wouldn't repeat what's already been said. There is legislation, it's in the LGA. It covers attendance, apologies, etc. In terms of other consequences, we have an election every 3 years, and so there's an opportunity to be re-elected at that point. Also, we regularly get inquiries from the media about attendance for meetings, typically on an annual basis, so it is reported. And other mechanisms available to council exist, like the appointments that you make to committees, to subcommittees, to chair positions. And so you do have a level of, I guess, mechanism available to you to manage these sorts of things in that way, in that manner. If you wanted to add something else into the Code of Conduct that specifically addressed meeting attendance and how you might want to address that, you could also do that. That's a discretionary decision. And so it could relate to things like the way that you will appoint membership on committees, for example, and or any other responsibilities that you might want to allocate to members. There may be some other mechanisms that council could consider, but we could potentially give that some thought for
I would like you
inclusion
to give
in
it
the
some
code.
thought, because I do think that, for instance, if a staff member didn't come and do their job, you know, there would be things said about that. And you know, I mean, obviously you wouldn't just accept a situation where someone doesn't turn up. And so I do think that there are obligations on us. And I do think so, you know, some of these kinds of issues might be helped by having like a monitoring and review kind of process and a code of conduct process. Like if we had a regular catch-up, for instance, with the chair, where there's an opportunity for you to raise issues you have or that an individual councillor has, that might help, because there's kind of something along the way where you get an opportunity to say, hey, look, I notice you just haven't been turning up as much lately. You know, so I mean, that might need to be built into a code of conduct process as well. But look, I don't know how we address this, because it did used to be the case, I believe, that, you know, people got paid according to which meetings they turned up to, and that probably wasn't ideal either. But I mean, but if we are accepting a salary, we do need to do our job, I think.
Thank you, Councillor. Point
Thanks.
made. Councillor Mahuta.
Okay, just to the code, and having been subject to the previous code a couple of trienniums ago, and aligned with the question I asked Nick, we don't have a speak up consideration under some kind of proactive inclusion, or as councillors or otherwise, where racism is the issue. I have to create a treaty issue to have that conversation here. So just given the training, given where we've been, I just think how we might do that. I would consider a Hōhau Te Rongo process. Again, when we've done this term, council benefited from the mana enhancing conversations they had with me and Kataroina. That is part of our natural process. So again, happy to feed that in if it helps, because there's a whole lot, I think, of conversations that can be had before allegations and or things have to be written down, which can say that when we are considering this, it's the actual specific complaint, not this, expense of everybody else's issue as well. So I just give that to you because it's the code is as good as it can be implemented. And I do agree with Councillor White. Council meetings were noted in our last code. Every other meeting of council wasn't. So attendance and that thing. So again, kia ora.
Fine. Councillor Teague.
Thanks, Chair. I've got a question and then a couple of comments. So have I understood this draft code that it would apply to a complaint not only by another member but by a member of the public? Right. Yes. So my comment around that is I think we have to be very vigilant around this because we could see a scenario where there is vexatious trolling of a member by the public. And I see that in the code there is sort of a regime of seriousness that's a great improvement. But I just go back to my own experience on this and just give you this example. So remember we had the think tank discussion and it was agreed that Chatham House rules would apply and that comments would not be attributed to a member. And then within 24 hours, a complaint was made by a member of the public against myself. And that was a complete breach of trust by someone around this table. And the former chair then made an apologetic response, which should have been summarily dismissed because it wasn't something that was, deserved a response because that member should never have received that information. So I think there needs to be a good deal of vigilance around that to sort of weed out those vexatious ones. So that's my first point.
So we'll just note that vigilance around that and identifying vexatious, I think that's, is a point made there, I think.
Yep. My second point is on page 415, paragraph 14.2. It talks about where the chair is a party to a complaint or is unwilling or unable to deal with complaint, then it's referred to the deputy chair. And in my opinion, that needs to be strengthened quite a lot. I think it needs to actually go further and say where the chair has an actual or perceived conflict of interest. And then the question is, well, then who decides whether the chair has a conflict of interest? And that, in my mind, should either be the chief executive or someone independent. And again, I refer to my own experience around this, where a certain complaint was made against a certain member, and the former chair had a clear conflict of interest, which was confirmed by legal advice, and the former chair did not stand aside. And so several weeks went by, and I was kept in the dark about it, and it was only when the new chair was appointed that was resolved. So I think there needs to be much more strength around those conflicts of interest.
So yes, so I would take from that, my view is that the chair and the deputy chair should take the advice of the CEO on potential conflicts of interest and be cognizant of those conflicts that are identified by in making the appropriate decision as to who is qualified to carry out the responsibilities then. So that's how I'd like to strengthen it in that way. But that's just my view. I don't know, at the moment we can come back to other, but I'd like Councillor Teague just to comment on that first before we go further, because are we able to put some
Well,
approach and then...
I think there needs to be a process around whether there is a conflict of interest or perceived conflict of interest, and then some clarity about who decides that issue, written into the code.
Yeah, so we've got to address that. Does the CEO comfortable in trying to find a road that deals with that?
Absolutely, and staff will have a look at that and maybe get some advice on how that can best be worded.
Because we're only, just so council aware, we are talking about matters which this council, as a council sitting around this table, find is the right way to deal with things. It's not necessarily, it's what this council thinks, and I'm going to take the views and get round the table as to whether they're heading in the right direction or not. So I'll take all views. Councillor Strange? Oh, you can come up later and talk to the discussion. It's just that there's a point made by the councillor. I've reflected on that, my personal view. I've asked the CEO to make a comment. We are now, if you like, moving around the table to get views, and you may have a view as well. Everybody's view is absolutely of the same weight. There is not, the chair doesn't have a view which outweighs anybody else's. It's a matter of whether we can find a way to present the matter that Councillor Teague has raised, which I personally think that we need to address in some way, whatever that be, I'm suggesting with the staff and the CEO to help resolve. Councillor Strange.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, mine's along a similar vein to Councillor Teague. When a councillor makes a public allegation against another councillor in a public meeting, without due process being followed or any facts or investigation being put around it. The process around the role of whoever's chairing the meeting in that example, and what might happen afterwards to remedy such a situation. And then also around councillor-only time and that whole integrity of Chatham House rules and what is said in private, not being assigned to a certain person, or how those sorts of things are enforced. I've heard it said before that, you know, Chatham House rules don't exist. So is it just a case of we don't trust each other? How do we get that open and honest dialogue? And yeah, so I just, like something around that mentioned, just the integrity of what's private and what's not. Thank you.
Yeah, good question. Put the mic across. Yep.
A little bit more. Some of your comments have had threads about having a little bit more process, which is informal, and that probably goes to some of what Tip has been talking about too, is the mana enhancing, perhaps a more of a te ao Māori perspective around conflict resolution.
Yeah. Councillor Nicol?
Yeah, totally agree with that, Sarah, and agree with a lot of the points raised so far. Many of you'll remember the work I put in middle training to try and get our code of conduct reviewed, and we made some really good inroads, and since then a whole lot of other stuff has happened, and I just want to say thank you, Sarah, for all the work you put in this and the rest of the team, because it is night and day between the one that we have currently and what this is. It is educational, which is always what I'd hoped, because rather than just briefly stating some things, it is, this seems to touch on a whole lot of the topics that I've come across over the past 3 years and really spells it out. So when somebody's coming in new, they will feel empowered, which is actually part of our, vision is caring for our place, empowering our people. And so, yeah, if we'd had something like this, I think we'd all been better off from the get-go. So, and I'd be hugely proud to share something like this with the rest of the country. But great to hear that LGNZ is still updating theirs, and so there's obviously an opportunity to get even more of the bigger learnings for the new triennium. So yeah, it's well on track. I'm feeling like obviously it'd be really awesome if this triennium we still had this, but we've got it. We've got the draft, and we've got what sounds like a lot of people who get it, and it sounds like more to how we run the process now anyway. So we've got a win there, and so yeah, hopefully the council, whoever's there in the new triennium, can really take and build on all of this what we've just been talking about and the feedback.
All right, thank you. Councillor Hodge.
Yeah, there's a couple of things. The first one is, can you clarify the question about the code of conduct being from the public against the councillor? Because I always thought this code of conduct was a councillor against a councillor, and the public uses the ombudsman or whoever, right? Right. There's someone else, but not our code of conduct. Ombudsman. How many times have we told the public, if you want to write a complaint about that particular councillor, you need to go outside, not this code of conduct? That's right. Right. Okay, that's fine. So here I am. I as you know, I have been involved with a few code of conducts over the time. What I haven't done, what has happened is all code of conducts do go to Democracy Services and then to the CEO. Now, I never once thought that the CEO was going to tell me the verdict or how to use that, because my view was he is the CEO and we put him there, and he doesn't have the right to tell us how to do so. But I did and always have used him as that sounding board, as that PL sounding board, him and Democracy Services. But as the deputy chair and with the rules, I made the final decision. So that's my thing about the CEO. I do agree that the complaints come to me after it's gone through Democracy Services, and the CEO has kind of given me a summary around it, as if it was the chair involved, of course. And I've only ever used Democracy Services as secretaries and advice. Can you go back in the rules and have a look at this? I don't like the way that letter is written. Can you rewrite it? That's what I did. But the rest of it, I sat with whoever the councillor was and worked out that lot. Especially when it's against the chair. I was never involved otherwise. If the chair wasn't a complaint, if the code of conduct was not against the chair, or he had a conflict, I wasn't involved unless I sat along with the chair, just as that other is. So I'm just making it clear that that's where the deputy chair sat during my period. I don't know what happened prior to my period. And it worked. And except for the very last one, I always talked about if the code of conduct was a bit outside my scope, I thought of independence. It's automatic independence from my view, because the last one I had to do, I found it a little bit way out of my scope. And hence why we ended up with the guy we got. So depending, I guess, on who the deputy chair might be in the future, a lot of this is understanding rules of the House, understanding the tikanga between one council and the other. Also understanding exactly where Democracy Services sit and then not the know-all and be-all of how a code of conduct is worked. And then having that really good relationship and understanding with the CEO around code of conduct. So I think we did okay, Jennifer, and I thank you for what you've done up to date. And yeah, I do understand what happened with Dennis's. I wasn't involved until a little bit later, and then I tried to pull that in as well.
All right.
So that's me. I'm okay with this. That's where chair sits in a relationship with CEO.
Thank you. Who have we got next? Just press the light there. You need one.
Yeah, I guess this was part of what I was referring to about some sort of reporting process back to council, because when it's an individual's role, i.e. the chair, to deal with a complaint, and Dennis is a good example, there's no one there, there's no process to make sure that that chair is doing things in an appropriate way. And Dennis's case is typical. It's just Dennis versus a chair basically, and because it's all kept in house, there's no one to I don't know where else you can turn to, you know. So either the chair, the person charged with dealing with the complaint, either has to report monthly to some other part of council on, I've received this complaint and this complaint, and these are the various stages I'm at dealing with them, you know. But because in this situation, Dennis was stuffed basically, eh? So that's kind of where I'm coming from. I think there's probably a couple of ways to deal with it, but whether it should be chair and deputy or chair and someone else, I'm stuffed if I know, but yeah.
Through the chair, Stu, there is a provision there that allows an independent to be quite significantly involved if necessary, and the reporting through the council on a regular basis would allow council to have some oversight as well. Yeah. The reporting through to council, and we could strengthen the provisions around this, would be discussed with the individuals involved prior to going to council, because you never know individual sensitivities till you ask them what they are, and then act appropriately given the feedback before that report actually goes up.
Good comment. Good comment. I totally think absolutely appropriate. Councillor White, what I'm planning to do is, you can see up on the board there, we want the feedback that's coming from around the table to inform a revised code that can be considered for the new triennium. So that's the way we're heading. So further comments to support that, please. Councillor White.
Yeah. Just want to support what Councillor Hodge just said. I think she actually brought up some really good points, and I think it actually worked really well. I think it did work really well, in the sense that you know, it makes absolute sense to be able to use the CEO as a sounding board. Very important, I think, that you have this code of conduct process restricted to complaints by councillors against councillors. I do think there's too much opportunity out there for people who don't like you to use it as a process to just undermine you constantly by putting in complaints, and I don't think that's helpful to anybody, and it ends up incurring a whole load of cost that's unnecessary. Just also wanted to say that I think the independent person is really important. But I also think when we use an independent lawyer, I think we should follow their advice, and councillors shouldn't be allowed to inflict a much greater punishment. I think the problem with that is that, you know, that there can be political influence with a decision like that, but also if an independent lawyer has looked at everything, we haven't all looked at everything, and I don't think that we should. But if an independent lawyer has looked at absolutely everything, and then they make a recommendation around the punishment, we should follow that. We shouldn't take delight in actually making it worse than what has been advised. So I think that's a really important thing, because it just removes the politicians from that wanting to poke people with a sharp stick, which sometimes happens throughout council, you know, that you get annoyed at people for various things, and then your opportunity comes along to actually have a really good poke at that person and make things worse for them. So I don't think we should enable that. And I think an independent lawyer would actually make sure that that doesn't happen. And, you know, it can create a huge amount of animosity if we do allow that to happen, and councillors end up imposing a much greater punishment.
I think I'd caveat that, this is my view, I'd caveat that with, depending on the seriousness, you know, on the grade of seriousness, then you might do that. That's just my view.
I do think an independent lawyer would advocate for a greater punishment if it was something that was really serious. Sometimes the council is prepared to deal with it. Let's say a minor misdemeanour doesn't need to go to an external party. No. If in the view of the chair and the deputy that's only of
of a minor nature, it doesn't need to go to an external party.
Yeah,
So
I'm
that-
not
if
saying
you're
it's
happy
for
with that,
everything.
yeah,
I'm not
yeah,
saying you
yeah.
don't get it. I don't think we
Okay.
should get a lawyer in for everything, but the serious things.
Yeah, I understand that. Councillor Nicol?
Yeah, thank you. I thought it was worth just commenting because one section in it that I think is quite light is this piece that keeps coming up about monitoring and reporting. So to me, it's what has come up so far is both how people are abiding to the code. That's one part of it. And the other part is how they're being dealt with. So you want to have a system to plan, do, check, act, and continuously improve both of those things, right? So I think it's the plan part is that we have the code. The do part is that we do our work, and then we just need those check steps on both how we're abiding and how we're dealing with. And so the one thing I would want to make really clear is that while I understand there's some trepidation around members of the public directly making complaints, one thing I would hugely encourage for this council or that council to consider is to have the CE or the executive lead team be able to make a complaint on behalf of their staff or on behalf of a member of the public who gets in touch about something, because leaving it purely for only politicians to make complaints about each other I don't think works that well. There are, I believe, probably more people that would have come forward to say that they've got an issue with something that could then go through a similar process of deciding whether it's frivolous or not.
Okay, last comments, Councillor McPherson?
Were you finished, Jen? Okay. Look, I feel quite strongly about this chair-CEO relationship. That's in a corporate setting and in this political setting, none of us know what goes on in that relationship. And there are things that happen in that relationship that we have no right to understand or be involved in. I think we've seen examples through this triennium where a chairman has enabled a situation to develop where Councillor Tegg got treated.
We should, I call a point of order there, we shouldn't be mentioning in this open session at all any names. I don't want to hear a name of a councillor even mentioned.
Let me rephrase that. We have seen examples through this triennium where a chair was able to drag the chain on a complaint, and it wasn't till a new set of eyes came in that situation was changed. So to Kataraina's point and to Kathy's point, and I think that both of them make a really great point. It's if the relationship between the next chairman and the chief executive has any sort of stresses and strains in it, there is no way our code of conduct should anticipate ramming the chief executive into a situation where he or she has to say to the chair, you've got this wrong, Chair. Right. So that's my first comment.
So before you go to the second point, the way forward on that is if there is a continuous review, and I'm saying we should be reporting back to council maybe every 3 months, maybe, where we say, it's still absolutely appropriate. In other words, you're revisiting that the code is still right, and if something's arising and you think the code is not dealing with it, then full council can talk to the code, not talk to the incident or the issue, to adjust to report back. So that was the first point.
I think Stuart Nebo made the point. I'm just
I understand.
I just don't want these codes of conduct that are hard to get just sort of set aside.
Second point?
My second point is, if I think about this triennium and our behaviours, it wasn't really until Tipper made a comment.
Don't make the void councillors' names.
It wasn't until
speak to the matter.
It wasn't until a councillor suggested that we need to consider creating culturally safe environments that I really thought about how can we do that better? So, Sarah, I think what I'm suggesting is in the code of conduct where we're talking about accepted levels of behaviour, if there's one thing Rangimaoria's 5 lessons have taught us is that we've been on a journey around cultural safety, and I think there should be a heading in the code of conduct that specifically speaks to cultural safety.
Yeah, that's, I think that's a valid point. If you're all round the table of that view, see, everybody's nodding their heads. So I think that's absolutely a good point. Thank you, Councillor McPherson.
Next point. The one thing that this council tried really, really hard to do, but we seem to find it quite hard, was to create council-only time. And the reason why council-only time, with none of this stuff and no staff in the room, the few times we were able to do that, as a group, we had fulsome discussions around a range of matters and we got ourselves organised. So I think the code of conduct should speak to what could be expected for a council to have time on their own. Now, I understand that creates stresses and strains in terms of the goima. I understand that, and that if we get together as a council, it's anticipated that there should be complete transparency into all of those meetings.
It's quite, we'll just call them, we will call these workshops and then we'll sweep. Correct?
Workshops normally have staff.
Not necessarily. A workshop can be of any type or manner that you so desire.
Call it what you like, as long as it's council only time. The next, if you like, the next rung down in the ladder is the time we get with our chief executive to have him give us a briefing. Those are priceless moments for clarity. So I couldn't see it in the code of conduct, but I think having a heading which says chief executive time with council and spell it out, I think that'd be really valuable. The next point I want to make is around conflicts of interest. I'm not sure, and I haven't got a suggestion, but I would ask us to apply our minds. There's a lot of words in here around conflicts of interest, but I would ask us to apply a little bit more deeper thinking around conflicts of interest and how we manage them, because we've tried really hard, but I think we've been ankle tapped in a couple of conversations where one or two of us have made comments, and I'm thinking, I wonder if that's a really intellectually pure comment. So I'm left wondering. Stu Nebane, and your comment around the status report, I think that's really important. When we talk about the Chatham House rules, there aren't Chatham House rules. There's one rule. It's the Chatham House rule. And let me tell you, it's because it's really clear. When a meeting or part thereof is held under the Chatham House rule, participants are free to use the information received, but neither the identity nor the affiliation of the speaker or speakers nor that of any other participant may be revealed. So, it gives you a fair bit of latitude, because one thing that struck me is we've had a couple of examples where we're in public excluded and matters have found their way into the public arena, and that's a real fail for us. I don't know the way around it.
So what maybe we can just have staff focus on is, does the code mention anything about when council's in public excluded, and maybe doing a bit of education around what that means and how you apply it and making that more explicit? So thank you for that comment, Councillor.
I think the other thing that I'd like to say is it wasn't till I was well through this triennium and one of you pointed out to me that you're here, Sonny Jim, to represent the entire Waikato. I'm not here to represent the Waipa King Country. And you do mention that in the code, but I think if you look back at our triennium, that would have really, really helped if every so often we were reminded that we're not here to represent the north, the south, the west, or the east. We're here to represent the totality of the region. I think we might have saved ourselves some anguish.
Can I make a comment there? One of the things we might do in that respect is mention about what each councillor, what the meaning of their swearing in, because I understand when you swear in as a councillor, you give an oath to work on behalf of the region.
Correct.
So I think that's very useful for you to mention that. We should actually bring that into the code that when you make that declaration, you are declaring you are working for the region in every time you make a decision. So I think that should be somewhere in the code there, because I think it's a fair point.
I've just got two other points I want. I've got two other points I want to make.
Other points. Good. Yes, they do. Yes, true. Agree. And that might speak when we're in the code. You could actually say one of the reasons why you're working for that is there are at least about currently 2 of our members who cross boundaries into constituencies. So I think that's an appropriate comment, and thank you for that, Sipa. Very good. Last point you got.
I want to, there's 2 points.
Make them quick.
I don't think we should ask the ELT to be able to make codes of conduct. I think we should ask the chief executive, and that should be the only person. And the reason for that is he's our only employee.
Yes. Well, just speaking to that, the CEO will act with his team. He is when they even present, they are actually working for him, and at his behest, he brings them to the table. So at every moment of time, every one of these staff is only acting and reporting through the CEO to council. So that's how we work it when they present. That's how I interpret it. Is that correct? Yes.
We had said before that the CEO and ELT to make complaints.
Yeah, it's effectively a CEO.
Yeah, and that leads to my final point.
Yes.
I think the code of conduct, you mention it, but I think you really need to stress it, because we've seen examples this term of how it's been abused. The ability and right to go and speak to these people behind us is not a God-given right. That is something we have to earn the right to do. And we can only earn that right by building the trust of the chief executive. So I know you mentioned it in the code, but for new councillors coming in here, if they think that they can just wander around the organisation and do whatever they like, I think that's inappropriate. I think they have to earn the right, and in the early days, that's getting the blessing of the chief executive. And that's something that we should be really strict on.
Thank you.
Because otherwise,
we know the consequences. I think all of us do. Thank you for all those comments. Well, let's go through quickly. Who's got the red light on next?
Angela. Oh, right.
Well,
Thank you,
you
guys.
have now.
Yeah. So, just commenting on that objectivity rule where it says that in the interest of the entire region, not the constituency that elected them. And for me, I find that quite funny, considering I have 3/4 of it anyway, and she has the other quarter.
Yes,
so
I understand.
how does this fit in the wording of Māori wool councillors, guys? Because I never talk outside my region, and mine is Māori. So I had the big discussion last night with the mayor of Waipa around it. So is that wording right when you look at the 2 wards that are in Waikato Regional Council, in theory? It's hard to say it. But anyway,
it's my view that, you probably are empowered more than many of us, but the reality is you are here to represent the interests of the whole region. And I'm sure you make a decision that impacts across your boundaries. You make decisions across your boundaries, so I'm very comfortable, and I think other councillors are too. Stu?
The concept of, and look, I trust the CEO will tell us if he's uncomfortable with the proposed new role, but the concept of Chris bringing complaints, or Chris and his team bring complaints from his staff about our behaviour internally is a logical one. I'm just not sure about Chris receiving, or the CEO receiving complaints from the general public about us. Is that a bit of a poison chalice? And maybe you need to put a bit of thought into that over some time. I don't know, but I think just want to be really sure that we're comfortable with that.
Yes. It'd be great if we had somebody who's an ombudsman within the organisation.
Look, we'll take that thought away, along with the other thoughts away, and to bring something to the new council, if you like. If we've got that feedback, I would bring you, if there are concerns, I'd bring to you probably in the session that we might be going into shortly, if there were any particular concerns. I'd probably raise it with a particular councillor if things were raised either from staff or a member of the public. But, you know, we've got to be very careful from the commentary before. We don't want it to be giving people an opportunity to do a witch hunt or something malicious.
That's right. Councillor Strange.
Yeah, thank you. My thoughts are just around when we're communicating about stuff that's happening in a committee, to tie in that committee chair into our communication,
yes,
so that no surprises policy. Even if you just CC them in or whatever, just so they're aware of what contact is happening with, especially directors and staff.
I'm absolutely on that page. I think one of the things that we could emphasise a bit more is the team and the delegation that councils have given when they appoint their chairs of their committees to take a leadership role. And so we should be recognising that whenever there's a communication, we should recognise that they have to be informed at the very least, if not participate in whatever release or whatever information is being imparted. So, yeah, I'm on board totally with that.
Yeah, and just one other thing, sorry, along those lines is I've experienced it a little bit within my committee when you have councillors from other councils contacting our staff directly.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering, Chris, around the process for that. I know I was slapped on the wrist from another local council for contacting their staff directly, and just wondering if we could maybe tighten up, because often our staff time does get caught up with long email threads, and just wondering, if we could just have a really clear process around especially other councillors from other councils tying up our staff time.
Right, we'll take that on board. I want to wrap this up quickly. So, Jennifer, Nicol, we'll have a very good conversation then, Tipper, and then we'll wrap it up, if I may. I'll finish off with you, Andrew, if you'll make that quick.
Yep.
So we'll all make our comments fairly quick and I'll wrap it up. Jennifer, Nicol?
Yep, it's super important to me that our staff feel very safe here, including in interaction with us, and so whatever powers need to be given to, and especially if it's repeated behaviour, so totally respect, Chris, your comments before around dealing with things one-on-one and low-key, which is what we should actually be doing with, decent time together for all sorts of things, but if it's repeated, there needs to be a good process to allow the council to be aware that that is happening so that they can help you fulfill your obligations under health and safety. And the last one was, actually wouldn't hurt to have our oath somewhere in this room displayed for us to be reminded and to make it feel more like it's not just a room but actually the council chambers. Thank you.
Right. Good point.
Last one from me. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear. I had it written down too. So on where there are breaches of tikanga, those that we must observe, and I give the example with the opening and things like that. When do we lean into the constituency base that we come from? We're here for some of that support and advice. So I think it's something we weren't leaned into over the whole affair, so it just took too long to resolve. So I think we can be, it's a help, and likewise if it happens anywhere else, I think we should be part of the remedy, just because it comes with our constituency stuff.
So that's what last comment.
Last comment.
Last comment.
Chris and Sarah, do you think there's any reason, or would there be any value to be added by you canvassing the opinions of the ELT into this document? Because we sit here with a thought almost, Chair, a one-sided view of our reality. None of us know what it's like to be in the ELT, and I'm just wondering, would this document be more valuable? We wouldn't need to know who said what, but Chris, do you think it would be more valuable if the ELT were able to give the author an opinion, not necessarily us, but the author? Would we get a better document?
Yes, and it's likely this will go through ELT prior to going to the next council anyway. You know, this is about getting feedback. Yes, I think so. We talk about these sort of things, not necessarily on let's talk about the code and how to improve it, but we talk about the things that it's encompassing anyway. I think some of what I'm just reflecting on Scott said is there's things about what's an appropriate good practice for a council to be operating effectively, what's the interaction and relationships between each other, the councillors, the council and or the chair and the chief executive and the executive and the senior staff and so on. And I think that's probably worthy. I think there's a broader discussion just in the code of conduct, which I think that we might have at the induction with the new council coming in, because and I think there's been some really good ideas come out of today. Now, the sort of thing like just a reminder maybe before a decision-making meeting, the council, whatever, that the purpose is to make the Waikato better, make decisions to fulfil our purpose and our reason for being, and to some of those constructive behaviours that we're trying to achieve it. I don't know they need to be specified in the code of conduct, but I think that the executive might have views on how the system operates as well. I think it's a good idea.
Right, that's a good way to finish up. Final comment, Marley, before we move on. You're going to take this forward in what manner, and then you're going to present to the incoming council?
Yeah, just picking up perhaps on the last thing that Chris said. He mentioned the induction program, and much of what you've talked about through the Code of Conduct review will actually be picked up in that comprehensive program. We always do deliver a induction program. It is challenging though for newbies because there's a hell of a lot of information that's delivered in that first 6 months. But another key piece of feedback that I'm hearing from this discussion is that it's not just what is contained within the document, it's actually about ongoing monitoring and reviewing of the way that we are implementing these things. So a key lesson for us off the back of this current term. And just a real opportunity going into the next triennium to learn from what has occurred this triennium and make some real improvement next time round, and having our elected members involved in designing up that system so that we can all buy into it and so that it can be as effective as possible. So thank you very much for your feedback. There is a lot that you've shared and it's really good stuff. And so we'll take it away, put it in the draft and present it back to the new council. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got a mover and a seconder, so I'll put that. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, carried. Thank you very much to councillors, and I declare the meeting closed. Thank you for a very productive day. Yes, we're going to catch up virtually immediately. We're having a 5-minute break and then we're back to the CEO to tell us his news.